Business news now, and Russian oil exports have exceeded levels reached before President Vladimir Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine in February last year. That's despite Russia's threats to reduce production after Western nations imposed heavy sanctions on crude oil shipments. But India and China have continued to buy Russian oil, which trades at prices well below international norms, according to the International Energy Agency. And that raises big questions about the efficacy of sanctions as Russia appears to dig in for a long assault on its southern neighbor. Well, for more on that story and the rest of the day's business news, including big job cuts at the UK-based wireless operator Vodafone, let's speak to Arise Business correspondent Laurie Laird, who is in London. Good to see you, Laurie. The West has imposed heavy sanctions on Russian oil, yet that appears to have failed to curb Russian export. What does that say about the impact of sanctions?
Certainly, Charles, there are some very difficult questions to be discussed about this very issue. How effective are sanctions? When is the best time to use them? And this news comes as the European Union is readying an 11th package of sanctions against Russia, but it certainly hasn't made that much of a difference in Russia's fundraising for its war machine. Now, the exports are and production are higher than they were before the invasion in February of 2022. The price of oil is a little bit lower than at that point. So Russia's revenues are a little bit less than they were, but it certainly is pumping an awful lot of oil. And you may remember, Charles, that after the EU and the G7 imposed that $65 a barrel price cap on Russian oil, Russia said, you know what, we're not going to play anymore. What we're going to do is we're going to cut production. We're not going to sell to anybody who we consider to be unfriendly, thereby driving up the price of oil. So we make more on everything we sell, and there's less going to the market to power energy intensive projects. That doesn't seem to have happened. Russia is still pumping a lot of oil and making pretty good money out of it.
And generally, Laurie, crude oil prices are under pressure, aren't they, despite forecasts of much greater demand as the year goes on?
Yeah, this is something I've been scratching my head over this for a couple of weeks now, Charles. Brent oil price, which is the international benchmark, at about $77 a barrel. Now, you'll remember in the beginning of April when OPEC announced a surprise cut in production, oil prices shot up. We are now below that level. And the International Energy Association, you mentioned them a few moments ago, has said oil prices are going to go up because there's going to be a greater demand for oil, particularly from China. But we don't seem to be seeing that. In fact, we're looking at a potential recession. I mean, that is the buzzword. Will the U.S. fall into recession this year? We're looking at some very weak European Union numbers. So is that demand for energy going to be there? I'm a little bit baffled at the IEA's forecast, and certainly oil prices are under pressure. There certainly seems to be more of a proclivity for oil prices to go down than they do to go up.
And Laurie, you mentioned China there. Let's turn to the world's second biggest economy. What's the latest economic news out of China?
And I don't want to keep bashing the IEA, Charles. They do tremendous work. But one of the reasons the IEA thinks that oil demand will increase throughout the year is they see a very robust recovery in China. And everybody assumed there would be a robust recovery in China. China was essentially locked down for all of last year. But we're getting data once a month, and none of it looks all that robust. This morning, we had a big rise in retail sales, 18% year on year. That does sound huge. But remember, China was essentially locked down a year ago. Analysts were looking for a much bigger rise than that. Industrial production up a little over 5% year on year. Again, nobody was really working last year. So 5% sounds like a great number, except for when you compare it to such a depressed number last year. So these data that we see coming out of China are a little concerning. And again, if we're counting on China to be the engine of a global recovery, at this point, we're not seeing that in the economic data.
Well, let's turn to the wireless operator Vodafone, based in the UK, where you are. Pretty big job cuts there. How serious is this cull?
Yeah, this is a huge number of jobs going. This is almost 10% of Vodafone's workforce of close to 100,000 people spread out all across the world. Vodafone, as you say, based in the UK, but has a very big operation in Germany. In fact, that's its biggest operation. And Vodafone has said that German operations are not doing that well. Spain was lagging. Italy was lagging. And essentially what Vodafone is saying is that we're not making enough money to continue to invest in 5G, all of this new modern kit that governments and consumers want to take advantage of. So the way forward for Vodafone looks a little unclear, but they are starting, as we can see, by cutting costs, cutting jobs. The new head of Vodafone has said, look, these are not good numbers. We have to change.
Well, you talked about the way forward. I mean, I'm curious to know if Vodafone has any plans to reverse course.
And this is where things get a little dicey, Charles. Vodafone has tried to effect a merger with a competing UK mobile company called Three, which is owned by Hong Kong investors. This was announced a couple of months ago. It's been very slow trying to put this thing together. If this deal were to go through, it would cut the number of mobile operators in the UK from 4 to 3. Now, in most big countries, this having 4 mobile operators has been a bit of a shibboleth. The fear is that if you go from 4 to 3, that's less competition, prices will go up. And that's exactly what we've seen in the US, where we have 3 operators, went from 4 to 3. Prices in the US for mobile phone chargers are well ahead of what we tend to see in Europe. But that looks to be the first thing that Vodafone would like to do. Now, the questions will be, will the UK regulators let that go ahead? The head of the UK regulatory authority, CMA, was asked this very question today, and she kept very quiet about it. She said, look, this isn't a done deal, this merger yet. We don't have all the specifics. Ask me about this when we have a real deal.
And I mean, the UK regulator is facing an array of issues, isn't it? I mean, there's been lots of criticism of the UK's blocking of the Activision Microsoft deal.
Absolutely. The head of the CMA, Sarah Cardell, who hasn't been in the job that long, is really facing a baptism of fire. Remember, she denied Microsoft's acquisition of Activision Blizzard, which is one of the biggest games makers. Her thinking was, if this merger were to go ahead, it may be that Microsoft doesn't allow this game to appear on other consoles, therefore killing competition. She didn't let it through. Microsoft and Activision went absolutely ballistic, Charles, and said that the UK isn't open for business. And these are real Achilles heels with UK politicians at the moment, that after leaving the EU, Britain is not a particularly safe haven for investments anymore. Really critical. As this is playing out, yesterday we had the EU wave this exact same merger through, and Activision and Microsoft proposed some remedies to keep competition going. The same remedies were proposed here in the UK. The UK did not take them up. As for where this merger goes now, it's been waved through in the EU. The US is looking at it, but seems minded to not let it through. The UK has quashed it, so it's not clear where this goes. But I do think the importance here, Charles, is that the way the regulators are starting to look at these sorts of tech deals, they've been accused for allowing big tech companies to get too big to acquire monopolistic powers. And I think we're now seeing regulators look very, very more carefully at these big tech companies.
Laurie, thank you very much indeed. Laurie Laird, Arise business correspondent, talking to me there from London.